we come this evening to debate essentially the Saloojee Declaration in support of breastfeeding. And I'm going to explain and just put the case to you why we are going to have this debate this evening. But you should have all received, I think, as you registered, a copy of the Saloojee Declaration. Not?
They're on the today.
Don't worry. If you don't have it now, we'll make sure you have it. But I've got slides anyway, so you're okay. I'm going to show you quickly on the slides. So the Saloojee, the declaration, came about as a result of a consensus meeting that was held a few weeks ago to look at the whole question of breastfeeding and what the breastfeeding policy should be in South Africa, and specifically focusing on HIV exposed infants and HIV-infected women as part of that discussion. Now, in the declaration that was produced, and you'll see this, there's a big preamble, and these are things that are not particularly controversial. Things like we're committed to the MDGs, that we're committed to that breastfeeding we know is extremely good, and the longer you can do it, the better. We know that, and that there was no debate about that. That ARVs for women are good, and that's all in the preamble. So then the Saloojee Declaration comes, and I'm going to go through quickly some of the points, and I'm going to focus on the point that we're here to have a debate about this evening. So the first thing is this statement that South Africa supports breastfeeding and exclusive breastfeeding and takes action to support this commitment. The second one is that we adopt the 2010 WHO guidelines on HIV and infant feeding, and that we will finalize a code of marketing conduct, national regulations for this, around the marketing of breast milk substitutes. There's a discussion in it that there needs to be a review of the legislation to support maternity leave conditions that will then in turn support breastfeeding. That comprehensive services need to be provided that would support women with breastfeeding, and that human milk banks should be established to support particularly infants that would benefit from access to them. So the really interesting point, and this is what we're going to be discussing this evening, and this is the point that's caused a lot of discussion and controversy, is the following. I'm going to read this out in full. Formula feeds will no longer be provided at public health facilities with the following exceptions. Nutritional supplements, including formula feeds, will be available on prescription by appropriate healthcare professionals for mothers, infants and children with approved medical conditions. The change here is clearly the first part in red. Formula feeds will no longer be provided at public health facilities with the following exceptions. Now, just bear that in mind. I'm not going to say any more because the two debaters are going to talk to that point. Before I go on, I just want to say something, because some of the debate some debates can get acrimonious, and I just want to share a quick story with you about a woman in a rush going to an airport, which is close to my heart. And the woman rushes into the airport, and she has several bags with her, and she gets to the other side. She gets there in time to have a quick cup of coffee, so she goes up with all her bags. There's a coffee and a packet of biscuits, sees an empty chair, a very nice-looking young man, sits down, coffee, biscuits. She opens the biscuit, she takes the biscuit, she drinks her coffee. The young man leans across and he takes one of her biscuits, and she's astonished. And she looks very hard at him. And she quite aggressively takes the third biscuit. And the young man smiles at her, and he takes the last biscuit. And she's absolutely furious and outraged because this young man, without any permission, has just eaten her biscuits. Anyway, he gets up, he says goodbye nicely to her, and he leaves. She's furious. But as she gets up to leave, she lifts up her bag, and there is her packet of biscuits. And she has eaten his packet of biscuits. The point about this story is that you might have a very strong mindset that you believe is right. But actually, if you open your mind and you look at things from another perspective, you actually find that there are many things in arguments and debates that you have not thought about. And what I would encourage us all to do is to say that this indeed is a debate. This is the sort of thing where there are no rights and absolute rights and wrongs, where there are shades of opinion, and that's what we need to explore.
Okay, so my objective this evening is to explain to you why you should be voting yes in support of the Saloojee Declaration and in support of the South African government's new policies around infant feeding for HIV-infected women. But now I don't want you to be voting based simply on your feelings. So I don't really care whether you want to vote because you love babies, or maybe you want to vote yes because you love breasts. I really don't care. What I'd like you to vote about is based on the evidence. And so what I'm going to be presenting to you is the evidence. And so if you can just think a little bit, put your feelings, whatever your feelings are, that's fine, they're your feelings, and you can have them, but let's vote rather on the evidence. So 2010 was a good year. I mean, we all remember 2010 as a very fun year in South Africa. And what happened in 2010 is there was really a revolution in the prevention of mother-to-child transmission. And by 2010, there was clear evidence that mother-to-child transmission could be reduced through all routes. So antiretroviral drugs could be used to prevent transmission happening intrauterine. So if the drugs were given during pregnancy, it was possible to reduce transmission during the pregnancy that occurs intrauterine. If you gave the drugs during labor, you were able to reduce the transmission that was happening during the labor and the delivery. And then finally, if you continued to give the drugs either to the mother or to the child during the breastfeeding period, you could reduce the transmission during the postnatal period through breastfeeding. And these became codified in the WHO guidelines that were finalized in 2009 and finally released in 2010. Really putting all of this huge body of evidence together. A massive amount of scientific work, much of it done in South Africa, scientists in South Africa working out exactly how to use antiretroviral drugs to best prevent transmission through all routes. But the 2010 revolution continued, because what happened with the 2010 revolution is it allowed us to think about infant feeding in a new way. And so from 2010, it was no longer necessary for us to have debates like this. From 2010, it was no longer necessary for us to sit here and talk about whether we should be giving formula or whether we should be giving breastfeeding and weighing up the risks and benefits. It was now possible to have a win-win situation. So we can combine what was known with the information about how to prevent transmission occurring through breastfeeding by providing antiretrovirals, and this could now be integrated into the new guidelines that were set up around infant feeding and HIV. And so this comes directly from the WHO report. The group considered that the effectiveness of antiretrovirals to reduce HIV transmission through breastfeeding is transformational. It's a paradigm shift, a change in how we think about things. And so in conjunction with the known benefits of breastfeeding to reduce mortality from other causes, it justifies an approach that strongly recommends a single option as the standard of care. So as an illustration, I'd like to show you one study that was done in Gaborone in Botswana. So this study, called the Mbabana study, took all women, HIV-positive women, coming to one of their services, and if women had a CD4 count under 200, they were given the national regiment. If they had a CD4 count above 200, they were given one of two regimens. And this regimen then continued through to 6 months, and women were encouraged to stop breastfeeding at 6 months, and rates of transmission through 6 months were reported in the study. The study observed a total transmission rate of 1.1% overall. This was a study of over 700 HIV-infected women recruited in the study, and treatment here started between 26 and 34 weeks of gestation. But if you look at my little yellow and green coding there, in yellow are all the transmissions that were detectable at birth. So these were infections that had already occurred either during the pregnancy or during the delivery, and there was very few transmissions in green there were the ones that happened during the postnatal transmission. And so in fact 75% of these infections had already occurred by the time that breastfeeding started. And so the postpartum transmission rate in the study through to 6 months is 0.28%. Okay, so really dramatic results. And this postnatal transmission rate of 0.28% translates into about 1 infection every 2,000 months of breastfeeding. okay, if you want to express it in those terms. So these are really, very encouraging results. And what they tell us is that antiretrovirals work. They're highly effective. It's really an excellent way to prevent transmission. And the Botswana study is not the only study to have observed such excellent results. There's several other studies. I've shown some of these here, all using slightly different regimens. And these are the transmission rates through to 6 months. And you'll see KIBS there looks like it's kind of doing the highest at 1.1%. And that study, in fact, used an antiretroviral drug regimen which is no longer recommended, which is known not to be very effective in viral suppression. So very consistent results with the Botswana study clearly having the best results, possibly because of incredible attention to adherence in that study, as well as starting that regimen during the pregnancy and not very much later, because some of these other studies started antiretrovirals later in pregnancy. So if we just contrast these results to what we would see without antiretrovirals, so HIV is actually inefficiently transmitted through breastfeeding, even under no antiretroviral situation. So if we work on the assumption of 1% transmission per month, what we would have seen here is a 6% transmission rate in the absence of antiretrovirals. So you might say, well, as the Schwani Declaration says, this is a very significant reduction. Yes, and it's a very significant reduction. So people write in articles, ARVs reduce transmission by 50 to 70%. You might think 50 to 70%, well, that's a very significant reduction. But no, ARVs reduce transmission by 73 to 96%. So I think we need to pay very, very close attention to the numbers. We have to look at these numbers very, very carefully, because downplaying the benefits of antiretrovirals can have very serious repercussions in thinking about this. And so this is not a time for pessimism about the benefits of antiretrovirals. This is a time to look very carefully at those numbers and think about how we're going to put programs in place to achieve these low rates of transmission. But antiretrovirals are not just about preventing mother-to-child transmission. Giving antiretrovirals to mothers also will save their lives and improve their quality of life and allow them to continue to live productive lives, looking after their children and doing the things that they want to do. So one must also remember that the guidelines for prevention of mother-to-child transmission made a very, very important distinction between those women who need antiretrovirals for their own health versus those women who do not yet need antiretrovirals. And the simplest way to make that distinction is based on CD4 count. So in the PMTCT guidelines, a distinction is made between HIV-infected women who have low CD4 counts, less than 350, versus those who have higher CD4 counts who do not yet need antiretrovirals, who have CD4 counts that are higher. So if your CD4 counts are low, you need antiretroviral therapy. And the primary purpose of this antiretroviral therapy is to address maternal health. And it has a secondary benefit, that it prevents transmission. And this is not starting and stopping antiretrovirals. This is antiretrovirals for life. This is lifelong antiretrovirals, and breastfeeding can continue for the duration of those antiretrovirals. If, however, your CD4 counts are higher, then it is not yet necessary for you to start on antiretrovirals. And then there are two options, the commonly known option A and option B. And the South African government has opted to go with the option A, which is the extended infant nevirapine prophylaxis. But both of these regimens, their primary purpose is to prevent transmission. And one can have a debate about option A and option B, but the key thing is we're not discussing option A and option B for women who have low CD4 counts. For women who have low CD4 counts, the recommendations are very clear that this is antiretroviral therapy for life. So a way to think about it is that the 2010 revolution really had three parts. So we now know we can use the antiretroviral drugs to prevent transmission. This allowed us to come to a win-win situation with regard to the infant feeding. And what happened at the same time is that the guidelines for when to start antiretrovirals were expanded to be more liberal and to allow starting of antiretroviral therapy at a higher CD4 count so that more people could benefit from using antiretrovirals. So it's important here that we keep our eye on the ball, because PMTCT is not a game we play alone. PMTCT is a game that we play with the adult treatment services. And so we need to remember that PMTCT has to work hand in hand with the adult treatment services in order to, in fact, prevent transmission. Because a lot of what adult treatment services are going to be doing will, in fact, have benefits for prevention of mother-to-child transmission. So we did some work looking at what the effects would be of introducing the new guidelines onto prevention of mother-to-child transmission. Now, a thing to recognize is that CD4 count is a very strong predictor of which children will acquire HIV through breastfeeding. And so these are data from our study in Zambia, where we stratified, and these were women who did not get antiretrovirals, and we looked at the risk of transmission if CD4 count was low versus if it was high. And in fact, it turned out that 88% of the postnatal transmissions occurred in women who had low CD4 counts, and that was, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. And more than 90% of the deaths occurred in women with low CD4 counts. And in the women with high CD4 counts, even in the absence of antiretrovirals, and these women breastfed for an average of 16 months in our study, the transmission rate was around 4% for women who had higher CD4 counts. So what would happen if adult treatment services just did their job correctly? Okay? So if adult treatment services just provide HAART to the women who have low CD4 counts, we can reduce transmission in this group down to very low levels. So you can do a little modeling exercise, and you can say, okay, well, the adult treatment services are doing a wonderful job and they get to everyone, and PMTCT are real slackers and they don't bother to do anything at all, and nobody gets nevirapine and nothing happens in that group. You still bring transmission rate down to 2%. So the point of this is your most effective intervention in this situation is by providing antiretrovirals to the women who need it most, not only to prevent transmission, but also for their own health. But I'm not so pessimistic about PMTCT. I think that PMTCT services can do very much better than this. And this also is not to say that I think the adult services are achieving 100%, but I think we've seen over the last few years really dramatic and unprecedented growth in HIV treatment services in this country and in other African countries, and that is a success we need to build on to expand access to antiretroviral therapy. So I'm actually very optimistic about the providing antiretrovirals. And at the same time, in 2010, when all this good news was coming out about the benefits of antiretrovirals for preventing transmission, at the same time, a lot of really bad news was coming out about what was happening with the avoidance of breastfeeding in programs that were putting in place FS-oriented counseling. So we did a study, ZEBS, the Zambia Exclusive Breastfeeding Study in Zambia, where we randomized women to either stop breastfeeding at 4 months or to continue breastfeeding for as long as they want. And this shows you survival of children who were infected by 4 months in the two groups. So in yellow there are the children who were randomized to the group to stop breastfeeding at 4 months, and in green were the group who were randomized to continue breastfeeding. And you see around the 4-month period where breastfeeding ended, a precipitous decline, a real increase in mortality around the time when weaning occurred. We have looked in our data, we've published in this in the New England Journal, that we found no difference in HIV-free survival in those who stopped breastfeeding at 4 months versus those who continued to breastfeed for an average of 16 months in our study. And what we found, the reason why there was no significant difference in HIV-free survival is that the mortality caused by early weaning was cancelled out by the HIV that was prevented. So yes, we had less HIV, that's there in purple, if you stop breastfeeding, but that was balanced out by having more uninfected child deaths by stopping breastfeeding. And this is all in the absence of antiretrovirals, which we now know can prevent those transmissions. My colleagues in Botswana did a study where they randomized women to either formula feed from birth or to breastfeed for 6 months. And in that study, they found a 2-fold increase in mortality. And this was in a relatively wealthy setting where the formula was provided, a lot of counseling was given, and where there was a health service safety net to intervene with these children. And during this period, there were no floods in Botswana. My colleagues in Uganda did a study where they did counseling, and women who considered it AFAS for themselves to formula feed chose formula, and women who considered it AFAS for themselves to breastfed, and there was a 6-fold increase in mortality in this setting. So you can see that clean water, good sanitation, education, and health services reduce, but they don't eliminate the adverse effects of abstinence from breastfeeding. My colleagues in Malawi have analyzed several of their data sets in HIV-exposed children, looking at what happens with different infant feeding practices. So not breastfeeding compared to exclusive breastfeeding, 9-fold increase in mortality. Not breastfeeding versus mixed breastfeeding, 2.7-fold increase in mortality. So exclusive breastfeeding is better than mixed breastfeeding, but mixed breastfeeding is better than no breastfeeding. Then we can turn to studies from South Africa, looking at survival in children who were either exclusively breastfed or children who were fully replacement fed from birth. A 2.5-fold increase in mortality. But here in Joburg, we think, other provinces are just another country. And we also know that these numbers are very scary. I'd show you more of these numbers, but these are very frightening, scary numbers. But this is not a time that we should be hiding from these scary numbers. These are numbers that we need to confront. So maybe South Africa's just special. Maybe we should not look at every single other African country. We should really, maybe we should look to Europe, would be a better comparison. So in the Netherlands, which is in Europe, in the Generation R study, a study of 4,000 births, very strong association between breastfeeding exclusively, either to 4 months or to 6 months, with better results if exclusive breastfeeding continued to 6 months, against upper respiratory tract infection, lower respiratory tract infection, and GI conditions, resulting in hospitalization. So this is very severe morbidity in the setting of a developed European country. We can move to the UK. The United Kingdom Millennium Cohort Study, 15,000 births, looking at hospitalizations for diarrhea and pneumonia. Very clear associations, reductions, either with partial breastfeeding or with exclusive breastfeeding, for reducing these rates of severe morbidity. So you might say, we know that England's got its problems. What about the USA? So the USA likes to commission reports. So they commissioned, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality commissioned this report that was published in 2007, went through all the literature from developed countries looking at the benefits of breastfeeding, found significant associations with pneumonia, diarrhea, otitis media, asthma, dermatitis, obesity, and SIDS. SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. The US National Maternal and Infant Health Survey, 8,000 births. Ever breastfeeding reduced postnatal death by 21%. If you breastfed for more than 3 months, postnatal deaths were reduced by 38%. Low uptake of breastfeeding among African Americans is one of the reasons for the racial disparities in infant mortality in the United States. IQ, okay, a controversial subject, but it's now been shown quite clearly one of the pathways by which breastfeeding benefits IQ via a genetic interaction looking at long-chain fatty acids and how they interact with a fatty acid gene metabolite. So South Africa is very special, but it's not so special that the laws of biology no longer apply. Lactation is a key component of mammalian reproduction, and breast milk has been specifically developed through evolution to provide the appropriate nutrition for children. So just because it's expensive, it doesn't mean it's good for you, and you really don't need to put everything into your mouth. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. My job is to tell you that government has got it wrong. Okay? My name is not Barack Obama, so my message to you is clear. Just say no. Okay. All right. Before I came through here, I asked my wife, it's quite an important meeting, what should I dress up with? And she said, no, you should be somewhat elegant but casual, that's the right gear. That didn't go down too well with me because, in fact, I was going to wear my favorite T-shirt, which looks something like this, and you can see it's quite crumpled. And many of you would recognize why I'm one of the greatest fans of that. I love Nestle. Okay, in fact, some people would say it's more than that. In fact, that's what I really love. I really love bugs because I love kids getting bugs. I love bacteria. The truth, of course, is that those who really know me is that I do love my babies, and I talk to my little neonates and what have you. However, I asked Louise what I should wear before I came through, and she suggested that, considering in the next 19 minutes how much diatribe and crap I was going to be presenting to you, that perhaps this would be the most appropriate. Okay. So, friends, colleagues, Louise has actually made my task quite easy. I'm not shaking, okay, because Louise is a great researcher, and she's presented to us results from various research projects. And in fact, there's very little that I disagree with her. There's a little bit, I'll come to it when I argue. But there's very little I agree. Breastfeeding is fantastic, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Netherlands or the UK. Breastfeeding is great. I don't disagree. I might be the devil incarnate in some people's mind, but I do agree with that. Okay, I do believe that ARTs for breastfeeding babies are great, and I do believe extended nevirapine works. So there's very little debate about that. The problem, though, is Louise is a researcher, and I'm not, okay, because I'm a pediatrician, a community pediatrician, and I spend every day of my life thinking about what's happening out there. And once one starts doing that, then unfortunately a lot of this data becomes much more difficult to apply. Okay, so my first point, I've actually got not 1, 2, or 3 reasons why government has got it wrong. I've actually got 12 reasons that Louise has told us. Formula feeding remains a legitimate HIV prevention strategy. If you think of it, we only have 2 ways to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV. Okay? We've got the use of antiretrovirals, whether to mothers or to the infants, or we've got formula feeding. Okay. If you're adults, we've got lots. You've got contraception, you've got condoms, you've got microbicides, you've got circumcision. We're now even talking about giving antiretrovirals to everybody, to all HIV positive persons. Okay. But we don't have that armamentarium as persons looking after children. And so then to discard one and saying, we don't like that one, we'll stick with one, is something that concerns me. Your intervention has to be incredibly successful for that to be the case. And I'm going to convince you in the next few minutes that that is not the case. So I'm very hesitant to do this. What really worries me is the kind of conversations we're having around this topic. Some of us, the devil incarnates, actually wrote an opinion piece after the Swanee Declaration in the Mail and Guardian. And I was very surprised at the kind of response we got from colleagues, respected scientists, who in fact called, and the letter that was first penned by us included people like Professor James McIntyre and Dr. Avi Violari and then Dr. And we were called ill-informed dissidents, because the kind of discussion I'm going to provide to you, that kind of name-calling doesn't do any good. Okay, so I'm making the point that, in fact, I'm going to convince you that formula feeding remains a legitimate HIV prevention strategy. But first, let me tell Louise a little bit more about South Africa. Sure, South Africa is not the Netherlands or the United Kingdom, but South Africa is not a single homogenous country. We are not living in the darkest Africa where every night we put on candles and we go and do our stuff in the forests or the fields, and that we bath every day in water. Now, I can show you lots of slides, but here's the statistics I want to. Let's take our province, Gauteng province. Did you know that in 2008, 99.5% of children living actually have access, are living in the urban area, but in fact, more than 50% of children in this country live in urban areas. More so, if one looks at adequate water, in this province, it's over 90% of water have access to safe water. And you can look at other provinces, including the Free State, the Western Cape, well above 90%. Okay, and I was told that, where do you get these kind of data? It's crap. Well, I can give you these sources if your site is good enough to read. The same with sanitation. Okay, well above 90% in some of the provinces. I'm not for a moment suggesting that it's the same all over. I fully agree. It's a country with vast diversity, the most inequitous country in the world. We know that. The Gini coefficient says that. Okay, but the point I'm making is then to say we all live in darkest Africa is not correct. It simply is not correct. Okay, and I'm also saying that, and even in Gauteng with these high numbers of urbanization, we have the highest rates of informal settlements. We have something like 22% of our population living in informal settlements. But despite that, they do have access to water and sanitation. Now, why am I making a big fuss about this? It's this issue of the point that has been made is that we are getting confused. We are confusing the mothers and the communities out there. The only way to do this is to have a single feeding policy, because a one-size-fits-all is what we need. The minute you start giving mixed messages, you promote mixed feeding. Now, that's a nice argument, but the truth is that's a nice concept, but life is not simple, and you can't always have simple options. Okay, so what I'm going to make the point is that we live in we have different environments, whether it's the provinces are different in terms of the rural-urban spread. I've showed you the differences in water, sanitation, even HIV prevalence. Okay, so what I'm arguing still is that there's still a role for infant feeding, but I do believe we need to be much more stringent on who we provide formula. And of course, formula, not just formula, but formula with the right kind of counseling and formula with support, which is what we haven't done all these years, simply because we've been doing whatever, somehow, whatever you want to do. If you want to support breastfeeding, support breast. You want to support formula feeding, if you want to support mixed feeding, tell the mothers about mixed feeding. We've really allowed it to slip. I'm very clear that if we do support formula feeding in the future, it has to be with the right kind of counseling and education. But anyway, the point I really want to make is that what I would be demanding then is that, one, if we do continue it, we do have to apply these FS criteria more stringently. All right, that's the first point, and I'll make another important point in a second. But I just want to talk about these FS criteria, and there's a lot of data on the slide. This is the work from the Ridflay, Powell, Ulazi studies. Okay, the only point of this here is that even in these 3 areas which are relatively poor, in fact, what they all found is that mothers who chose to formula feed, the argument that was being made here was that, in fact, a lot of mothers were making the wrong choice. But I want to use the same data to indicate to you that if you look at the various FS criteria, they found that the pipe water in the household, fuel, whether it was paraffin or petrol, and disclosure were perhaps the 3 critical ones. It didn't matter whether you had a fridge in terms of compliance with FS. And in this situation, at least a third of these mothers, even in these peri-urban and urban, were able to successfully have those 3. But much more important is this slide, which indicates that, in fact, formula feeding was the safest option. If one looks at 36 weeks, transmission or death, formula feeding was by far the safest option. And then if you chose to breastfeed, 3.3 times risk. And in fact, if you met the FS criteria, but chose not to formula feed, your risk also went to 3.3. Now, obviously, this is old news, because in those days, we did not have antiretroviral options. But what I'm saying is that in these kind of South African settings, it's clear that if you're looking at HIV transmission and death, formula feeding gives you the clear edge. The terrain has changed. I'm not going to be arguing that, but I'm saying the terrain in South Africa does previously suggested formula feeding was the preferred option. And if you prefer hazards ratios, then a 50% reduction simply if you had pipe water, and a 68% reduction if you had those 3 FS criteria. Okay, so point number 4. Is it possible? Louise showed us figures that in settings like her own, the study she did in Zambia, if you formula fed, you didn't get HIV, but you died from all the other complications. If you decide to breastfeed, you got saved from diarrhea, pneumonia, but you died from HIV. And so in the end, the difference is not very much different. Okay, that's a point. And this has been shown in many other settings. That what she didn't tell you, and this, the devil is always in the detail, is in that Zambian setting, the mortality in her sample was well over 200 per thousand. Children were dying in that setting because the care in Lusaka, wherever the study was done, was lousy. And whether you breastfed or you formula fed, you died. Okay, if there was a district in this country that had a mortality, an infant mortality of about 200, I'd be very, very nervous. So my message, context matters. Okay, you can't translate Malawi, Zambia, even rural Botswana and say that will happen in South Africa. And in fact, I challenge Louise and anybody in the audience, if you've got figures that show that survival of children on formula feeding is worse than breastfeeding in this country, then you should come and bring that through. You'll have your chance, Louise. Okay, coming on to the next point. All right. The government has made it clear. When I was at the Swane meeting, I can tell you it wasn't a consultation. I tried very hard to get my say. It was an orchestrated, strategic, pure, what's the word I'm looking for? It goes to my mind. But there was very little consultation there. It was one presenter after the next saying what the policy was. Irrelevant. But in fact, when I tried to make the point, I was quickly quiet. The whole group was very clear. Unlike this group where 62% believe provinces had a choice, everyone said, no, we are all the same and we shall all do the same. I'm saying there needs to be a difference. Come on, we are logical, intelligent people. Clearly what happens in rural Transkei cannot be the same in urban Soweto, and we should consider that. The intervention that we're offering may be very successful in both settings, but still, they're not exactly the same. But more importantly, now at Gauteng provincial meetings, I'm told, no, we toe the line. Gauteng, this country is a federal system, and provinces can make up their own minds. The Western Cape is the only one, they've got the DA there, and they're always making trouble for the ANC, but they do have their own minds. But I'm saying we have a responsibility, that's the argument I'm making, to choose what is appropriate for our children in our province. We can differ from national, and we should make it if we believe the case. The argument has to be made. All right, so I'm going to make one or two other points. I actually believe this new policy is retrogressive, and it's actually anti-poor. How do I justify that? Well, let me tell you the retrogressive. You know, way back in the 1990s, WHO came along and said, all you guys in the developing countries, you breastfeed. All you develop, I'm using those words, I don't like those. All you develop, you formula feed, because you know how to formula, the rest of you, and then the rest of us stood up and said, don't think we're all the same. We can, and that time, obviously, formula was the better choice. Of course, we can formula fed. So it changed, and it became individualized choice. It was much more rational that we would choose. The fact that we didn't apply it very well here is beside the point, but mothers have and continue to have a choice of what they wanted. We've changed that now, Terrain, again. We got back to those old days where we says, we'll tell you what's good for you, and you'll have to do with it. Now, I know what Louise is going to tell me. We're not banning formula. We're just saying the government will not support formula. What's my retort to that? Well, the truth is, I in fact support that view, that perhaps as a public health practitioner, we shouldn't be giving everyone who qualifies for it, who meets the FS criteria, automatically formula feeding. What I would say is that, sure, if you're a middle class, you can afford the formula, like all other healthcare in this country, by all means, you go and get the additional care yourself. However, there are many, many poor women, all right, who meet the FS criteria, and particularly in provinces like this in the Western Cape, who meet the FS criteria, but are just too poor to be able to afford formula. And in my calculations, we would probably be talking to about 30,000 of those women. And to deny them a choice, and I'm going to tell you why formula feeding with support remains a legitimate choice. I'll reinforce it in a moment. But to deny them that is actually being anti-poor. You're telling poor women, you must take this option, the option that might result in your baby having HIV. Of course, if you can afford the feed, by all means, go the zero HIV infection strategy. That is anti-poor. All right, and to pursue that particular line, I think anyone who's in the field is already beginning to hear all these different scenarios. I'm going back to work, I can't continue breastfeeding. Got this teenage, she needs to go back to school. I've got the granny who's looking after this child, the mother is deceased. These scenarios again and again, where breastfeeding would be great, it might not even be FS, but there's no one to breastfeed this child. How do we deal with the situation? The Tshwane Declarations makes no provision for that. They basically said, we'll treat medical conditions. I was sitting at a meeting today and we're saying, yeah, medical, we'll give maple syrup urine disease, and we'll give galactosemia, and we'll give those conditions free formula. And how long should we give? Should we give for 6 months or a year? That is irrelevant. I mean, I don't care whether you give free formula to a condition that's 1 in 20,000 per thousand. The more important is, do we make some kind of exception for social? And the policy has not engaged with it. I'm not sure what we're going to be advising the granny or the school or the working mother, particularly if they're FS and they're poor. Now let me tell you about the evidence. The evidence. Okay, so Louise presented our evidence. We're all very impressed. She says it's not even 70%. It might be as much as 80 or 90% effective. Great. But what are some of the problems with the evidence? A lot of the new policy, the WHO policy that we've adopted, is based on extrapolation. Okay, so no study has given nevirapine, I'm talking particularly about extended nevirapine, for more than 6 months. WHO quickly, without any evidence, extended it to 12 months. Okay. The extrapolation made is that not all of these studies obviously had to give it in a study situation to better mothers. Louise told us how important CD4 counts are. In all of these studies, women had CD4 counts more than 250. We are assuming that an intervention like nevirapine will work equally well in children in mothers with CD4 counts of 100 or 150. That hasn't been studied. That's an extrapolation that's being made. Okay, and so there are these kind of extrapolations that suggest that this policy will work. Okay, what about mixed feeding? Many of these studies, obviously women who are exclusive breastfeeding. The reality we know is that women will choose. We know exclusive breastfeeding is not going to rise from 8% to 90, 100%. Most mothers who are going to be on ARTs or extended nevirapine are going to go the mixed feeding route. Will it work for mixed feeding? We're not sure. I think it probably will work, but that's not a given. So there's a lot of extrapolation occurring. More importantly, and this is where I come in as a community health practitioner, we are assuming, this is the biggest exercise that we've taken on. We're taking 300,000 mothers with 300,000 mostly well children and saying, you're going to put this child for the next year on this drug. Well children, daily, he must get this drug. I mean, I'm talking particularly again about the nevirapine extended one. I'm not talking about maternal art. I'm using that example. Every month they have to come in. The child has to, is this going to work? We barely managed to give single dose nevirapine and transition to dual therapy. We're now expecting throughout the country clinics to be doing it. We know how clinics work. We tried cotrimol prophylaxis earlier on. It was a dismal failure, at best 30%. Even our vitamin A programs are not working. Forget it. What about the stores? We know long periods where drugs are not supplied to clinics. Sometimes in the really poor areas, no Panado, no ampicillin, no penicillin. Is there going to be a nevirapine stock out? You bet it is going to be. Is it going to matter? Well, it depends for how long. But this is not a given. This is an enormous exercise that is going to have problems. Okay, so moving on. The argument I heard at Tshwane was, you know how much we're spending on formula feeding? We spend almost more than 200 million rands a year. That's a lot of money. It's the most expensive component of PMTC. It's much more expensive than the drugs. However, because of that, let's stop the 200 million and we can have 1,000 or 10,000 community health workers. I wish life was as simple as that. It's not just about cost, it's about cost effectiveness. And what I'm going to tell you, because I've only got about a minute and a half left, is that in fact we've done, and it's the Priceless team, and Karen Hoffman and Mandy and others have done some work using South African data to say, can formula feeding be cost effective, or is extended nevirapine for 6 months more cost effective? And the answer shouldn't surprise you. It depends particularly on what your underlying infant mortality rate. But using South African data, we've clearly identified that in an area with an infant mortality rate of around 60, which is a rural district, clearly nevirapine, extended nevirapine, more cost effective. But in a setting like Soweto, where your infant mortality rate might be 25, formula feeding with support is actually more cost effective. Okay, so I've already made this point that this new policy is a huge public health experiment. And so I get on to my last point. Okay. Why am I so passionate about formula feeding? I'm passionate because I think about Millennium Development Goals. I know that HIV still causes up to 60% of child deaths in this country. Pneumonia is important, diarrhea is important. Rotaviral vaccine and pneumococcal vaccine has been spectacularly successful, but HIV remains a cleanup. We must take the high road, not the low road. The low, I'm sorry, I thought I'd got this off. Okay. I'm really sorry about this. The high road says that we will have an HIV-free generation, and that means no children with HIV. Even with this best data that Louise has given us, it still means something like 5,000 children each year with HIV annually born in this country. That's not acceptable. We have to take the high road. The high road is make our country a country where you can safely formula feed because people have got jobs, people have got water, they've got sanitation. That's the high road. It's not the low road. People can't do this. Therefore, let's just make sure that they formula feed and they can stay in their hovels and poor houses and what have you. And so I'll end off with what I say, that what the policy should have said, and I'll say it in 30 seconds. I think what the policy should have said is that breastfeeding is fine with support, ARTs, but formula feeding remains an option if you are FS and if you are poor. And how would I decide on poor? I would use the same criteria as we use for the Child Social Support Grant. I leave you with a final quote. Okay, and it says, the unreflective desire to simply enforce the same programs in vastly different circumstances, however, does nothing to address these inequalities and has been shown in the field of infant feeding and HIV to do considerable harm. Who do you think said that? Okay, Louise thinks she knows. She knows because it was Louise Kuhn who said that. Okay. Thank you very much.
I thought you would have a very good mic. In fact, I might run around, but that might be difficult.
If the number of breastfeeding mothers in South Africa not on ARVs is 15 to 20 times higher than the number of breastfeeding moms not on ARVs in the USA, it again becomes difficult to compare the situations. Thank you. So it all rests firstly on what percentage of moms are not on ARVs. It's unethical if we have a high percentage of mothers not on ARVs to expose them to exclusive breastfeeding. Thank you.
Thank you. Other hands? Clearly I've been too intimidatory in my chairing. Not getting any hands there. Where was the hand?
Okay, my question is on how can an AFAS being met by the poor person, because one of the aids there is affordability. And if a person is poor, how can that person afford? Because she doesn't have to buy. So how can that be met? Because UNICEF is saying there should be no no's in that affairs in order for it to be met.
One by one, receive.
So the first comment, Louise, the first comment I think was really aimed at your argument, which is about it's unethical if you don't have people on breastfeeding. The second one is about cost. So could you both take those?
Okay, well, I think to take the question about your point, I think your point is really well taken, because the most important thing we can do is make sure that the women who need it get access to antiretroviral therapy. So we shouldn't be sitting here talking about using nevirapine prophylaxis in women with a CD4 count of 150 and arguing that there's not evidence that nevirapine works in women with a CD4 count of 150, because we should never be giving nevirapine prophylaxis to a woman with a CD4 count of 150. And so we need to be investing our resources in pushing up that percentage, because there's been remarkable success in getting people onto antiretrovirals in this country. It can be done. There's been a massive mobilization, both from civil society and from the health service, with government and with donor support. It's been a remarkable success, and our ethical obligation is to move forward with those programs as rapidly as possible and not divert resources into programs that can only cause harm.
So I'll also have a quick response to that, and I think Louise has done again the usual. There's what should happen and what will happen. We know that the women with CD4 counts less than 250, 150 are going to be in a setting where in fact antiretroviral will not be available, and those are exactly the babies, the mothers and babies, the babies who will be subjected to extended nevirapine. So what should happen and what happens, we know the chasm is too large. Dealing with the question that was addressed to me is that how can you be poor in FS? And I think the slide that I showed about what was the situation in Rietvlei, Parel and Umlazi was exactly that. That in fact, even in these peri-urban and rural areas, they found that at least 50% of those women had water, and at least 33% of those women were FS. I'm not arguing for the most rural parts of our country to be given formula feeding. I'm being very clear. I'm saying it should be a provincial policy and maybe better still a district, but we're not ready to be district in this country. But provinces that have high rates of urbanization, water, sanitation, all those things, they are the ones. And you will get poor people there who actually do have water and sanitation. I've told you the numbers for Gauteng. So poor doesn't mean you don't have the things that allows you to be FS.
Thank you very much. My question will be directed to Louise, pertaining to the very same figures we're talking to of women who would actually be covered with antiretrovirals for them to safely breastfeed, which is good and much appreciated. But what happens to a situation where these women, it's not like having inaccessibility to antiretrovirals, but socially and culturally the environment doesn't support her to be on treatment. She cannot take it religiously. She's just not in a situation to come out of the cocoon. And she doesn't want to breastfeed, but she cannot afford formula. And she is in a situation where she can formula feed safely if provided. What happens to those? Because currently in South Africa, we know we are not yet in a situation where women are coming out, they are taking their treatments adherently, and we also as government are not yet in a situation we are providing them properly. What happens in that situation, seeing that we have decided to abruptly withdraw a policy that was providing for such care?
Yeah, I think what you draw attention to is very important, because this does have to be done extremely cautiously and with correct information to health workers and to the community. It definitely can't be abrupt weaning off the formula. There needs to be a very cautious approach to this with education, because I think there has been a lot of miseducation of healthcare workers. There's a lot of confusion among healthcare workers about this. There's a lot of incorrect information that healthcare workers have and that the community has. And I think we're going to have to invest a lot in education, in explaining, in working through this. And the issues of stigma are very real. There's stigma around antiretrovirals, there's stigma around formula, both of which are problematic. We need to work around reducing stigma around HIV, and so certainly this is not, no one thinks that this is a simple thing to undertake, but it's a step in the right direction, and there needs to be continued work on education and information around this, so that some of these misinformations and stigma can start to be reduced.
Hi, can I just ask a question for both Haroon and Louise? And that is, do you think that we know enough about the long-term impact of early exposure to extended daily doses of nevirapine? And also, do we know enough about potential nevirapine resistance? Thank you.
Maybe I'll go first. Yeah, I think very relevant questions, both of them. We don't know enough about the effects of taking the nevirapine for a long time, and the issue of resistance also is concern. However, on both counts, I would think that the available evidence suggests that in fact those are not going to be major considerations. So I'm not unduly concerned about that, but we've been in the situation before where steroids in newborns is my favorite example for chronic lung disease, where we thought was fine and suddenly 3 years later found all kind of developmental effects. So, but not a cause for great concern for me.
I mean, I would share that same point of view, and I think, you know, we've got to think in medicine there's never risk-free interventions. And so antiretrovirals are good, but they're not perfect. And so there are going to continue to be problems with antiretrovirals. And so in thinking about all of these things, it's always a risk-benefit evaluation in terms of what are the choices here. And choosing the option where we minimize harm reduction. We're never going to get to a perfect situation with any of these interventions. We have to look at a situation and see which option has the better outcome. So quantitatively looking at the choices, what's available, given the risks and benefits of the different options, and we have to go for an option which does the least amount of harm.
Thank you very much. My question is to both of you. What do you think of breast milk banks? You never made reference to it, and yet it is also mentioned on the Tshwane Declaration. Thanks.
Do you have an opinion?
Very brief response, because it's not the main point of the debate. So very brief, because I'm trying to get a couple of other questions in.
Okay, yay breast milk banks.
Yay, breast milk banks.
I just wanted to ask an ethical question about if you're HIV positive and you're breastfeeding and then you have to go to work, should you get formula? But what happens if you're HIV negative? Should you also get formula then for the same reason?
Okay, so I'm very clear about this, is that we're not trying to deal with a social problem here of malnutrition. We're dealing with a medical condition, and we're trying to find a legitimate strategy for it. So for me, I've made the point, formula feeding is a legitimate HIV prevention strategy. It's a medical intervention. It's not a social intervention.
And I think we need to, be careful about posing things as ethical questions, which are actually medical questions about which is the better option from a risk-benefit point of view. So I'd be very cautious about posing questions as ethical questions when we don't even know, what is which alternative is going to have the best outcome. And so I think we need to think about things from the public health point of view, from quantifying which would be the better option in different situations, rather than framing it as an ethical issue. Rather, we should look at what the actual outcomes are with different alternatives.
We are now conducting one of the biggest experiments in the history of our country, and we're using our little infants and young children as laboratory mice, and we are holding their lives in our hands, because we're heading in a situation really where we are subjecting our children to an experiment based on hope, not on science. Okay, we hope that all these mothers will exclusively breastfeed for 6 months. We hope that the health system will come to the fore and start providing the drugs and having them available and making sure that children get a consistent. We hope that pregnant women will get onto antiretroviral sometimes. Too much of hope, too much of wishing, not enough based on the reality out there. The truth is that if this program that we are now subjecting 300,000 children annually to were a study, a clinical study, it would have to go to an institutional board. And I would tell you that there isn't a single IRB or ethics in this country that would accept a study where your hypothesis is unclear. Okay, we hope that child survival will be better with this strategy, but we're not really sure. We don't have very strong evidence. We've done no piloting. We don't know whether we can handle 300,000 children. Okay, we've got no monitoring pen. We're going to do this, and then hopefully things will go heavy, because the Department of Health doesn't have a monitoring plan. Okay, and we're not even sure whether we can measure the final outcome. Now, can you imagine any ethical body anywhere in the world agreeing to a clinical trial? Yet, that's exactly what we're doing to children in our country. This is not a time for extremism. I'm not trying to be polarizing, but we really seem to go from extreme to extreme. There was an era where we were yay, rah, 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 formula feeding. We've done the whole swing now the other way. This is not the time to be. We need to do what's best for the children. I absolutely believe that nevirapine, extended nevirapine, that ART will work for our children. I'm hoping that the kind of figures Louise is saying, 60, 70% will be the reality. We'll have 2% transmission rates as in some studies, perhaps 3% at worst. The truth is I'm not sure that will be the case. I am expecting chaos for many years. I know what's our health system like. And so to have hope and trust and faith is not enough for me. Okay, we have to base it on the realities, and the realities are clear. Louise's final comment was that you can't do all the research over and over again. You have to base it on the evidence you have. But I think it's clear from what I've said is that this is the question where, in fact, the evidence is not clear. There are some questions where you can extrapolate. Here, you cannot extrapolate. And so, as we go forward, my final point is that I really plead with the National Health Department to perhaps not take this extreme view. It's almost as a kind of a revenge that we're going to make sure that breastfeeding is at all costs. We have to be a little bit more pragmatic and practical, and I've suggested a way forward. Yes, for the majority of our women, let's promote the default option of breastfeeding. But where women want to formula feed, where they are FS and they are poor, let us find mechanisms to support that. This is not a win for everybody. Let's make it a win for everybody. Formula feeding with support, education and counseling, as Professor Bowdy said, extended nevirapine with counseling and support. Both of them with support, the right option. Going one way or the other, bad choice, poor evidence, really not something we should go for. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not quite as slick as my colleague here, or as cute as my picture. And so I'm not able to take his words completely out of context. And I stand by my comment, which was represented there, because an implicit argument in what my colleague is saying is he's saying we all need to be like the United States. And because the United States requires by law, not by choice, not because parents want to, but requires by law that HIV positive women formula feed their babies. Because that's what's recommended in the United States, that's what we have to do in South Africa. That's implicit in his argument. And he's able to make that argument, and I think he's shown his true colors by taking my quote out of context, by refusing to acknowledge that context, which is the subtext of this debate. So 2010 was a good year. In that year, we were quite clear that ARVs work to prevent mother-to-child transmission. But my colleague's very pessimistic about antiretrovirals, okay? He's just given us a long list of why we think antiretrovirals are not going to work. So what's the catch with antiretrovirals? Is it the cost? Well, how could you possibly justify giving a woman with a CD4 count of 150 formula to prevent transmission because it's cheaper than giving her antiretrovirals for her own health? You know, that makes absolutely no sense. It's not the cost. If you look carefully at the cost, and WHO has done very careful calculations on this, antiretrovirals are 2 to 6-fold cheaper than providing formula for the appropriate groups. So it's not the cost. Is it toxicity? No. These drugs are not completely safe, but in a risk-benefit situation, toxicity is not a big issue. Drug resistance? Yes, drug resistance does occur, but we know how to treat drug resistance. So what's the catch with antiretrovirals? Okay, what's the catch? Well, the problem is you've got to take them. Okay, so it doesn't help if they're lying around in your handbag. They just are not going to work. And so I'm not at all complacent about how difficult or how easy this is going to be. This is very difficult. Programs to provide antiretrovirals are difficult, and this is where we should put our investment. This is where we should put our time and our energy into making these programs work. So in the my colleague's article to the Mail and Guardian, he says, well, if the infant mortality falls below 25 per 1,000, people should formula feed because that's the safest. So is an infant mortality rate of under 25 a threshold that you could decide? So I thought, well, where did he get that idea? Who said 25%? 25 per 1,000 as a cutoff. And then, oh my goodness, it was me again. Okay, so in 1997, I published a paper where we looked, in the absence of antiretrovirals, where was a safe threshold where the number of deaths that you were going to cause by giving formula was exactly equal to the number of HIV infections you were going to prevent by giving that formula. And when you do that calculation, it comes out to about 25 per 1,000. But what's the problem? Now, I'm happy to be quoted. I'm very happy that my colleague has gone back and found my 1997 article. But what's the problem with this? It's out of date. Okay? So, if we use current data, and I do exactly the same calculation, it's pretty straightforward modeling here. If we look at how many HIV infections and deaths we're going to cause among formula feeders, and we look at how many HIV infections and deaths we're going to cause among breastfeeders, and we take current transmission rates, so about 2% transmission during labor and delivery, about 1% transmission during postpartum, which is what we can get, so that's a 3% overall, and we look at an infant mortality rate of 10 per 1,000. Okay? Maybe there are pockets of Johannesburg that have an infant mortality of 10 per 1,000, but I'd be very surprised. And then we take a relative risk of 2, done in urban Botswana, okay, with provision of free formula, excellent counseling, and what do we find? Okay, so every 1,000 formula feeders, we get 40 either an HIV-infected child or an uninfected child death. For every 1,000 breastfeeders, we also get 40. But what's different is in the formula feeders, we've got 20 HIV infections and 20 deaths. In the breastfeeders, we've got 30 HIV infections and 10 deaths. Okay? So what happens is the risk-benefit associated with formula feeding shifts when you provide antiretrovirals. So providing, in the absence of antiretrovirals, 25 might be a reasonable outcome, but it shifts way down to just slightly higher than the United States when you provide antiretrovirals. But the trouble with these models is the assumptions. And a big problem with this model is that it assumes that an HIV-infected child is equivalent to a death. But this is not true. HIV can be treated. And I'd rather have an HIV-infected child who can be treated than a dead child that I can do nothing about. So I think we need to be very, very cautious. Very, very cautious in this area. We have to tread very, very carefully. We need to give unbiased and accurate information which keep the numbers straight. We need to not be pessimistic about the benefits of antiretrovirals. We have to be optimistic about the benefits of antiretrovirals. And we must not live in false hope about the safety of formula. So just say yes. Okay? Yes to what? Okay? Yes to drugs and breastfeeding. So yes to healthcare, no to unhealthy commodities. Thanks.